The same thing is true of God. When you spend time with God, you get to learn that voice. Here's some ways to be doing that. I got 7 ways. So if you want to take notes on how to learn God's voice, here's 7 quick things you can do. Number 1, eliminate distraction. Eliminate distraction. We live in a world that's filled with iPods, cell phones, TV, email, advertisements, shopping, hormones gone wild, speed, exhaustion. All of these things can get in the way of hearing God's voice. And if you want to put yourself in a posture to hear God best, you're best in a place where you get away from the speed and the distraction and exhaustion of life and make space to hear from God. I know some people are at different life stages that are more conducive to making this happen than other life stages, but in whatever capacity you can for the life stage that you're in, you make space to hear God's voice. Now, in this moment, don't expect God to answer the same way you get answers on email and texts. You know, we've come to a place where we expect instant answers from our texts. Well, God does not usually text you back with the same speed that your BFF does. You know, sometimes God takes days, months, years to answer the questions that we're asking. Sometimes it's his best plan for us, and he does deep spiritual work while his answer for us is wait. And so we wait to hear God's voice. Second thing is just get some silence and begin by listening. Samuel, when he was a little kid, came before God. He heard God speaking. He said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that's a phrase that I like to hear. Whenever I come to God and I want to hear his voice, I'll say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Samuel did it when he was a little kid. And just as an aside, kids are not exempt from hearing God's voice. As a matter of fact, little kids sometimes hear God's voice with much greater clarity than older people do, because they're not messed up with all of the mixed messages and skepticism and bumps in life that we have. They just trust and hear God's voice. And it's amazing how God speaks to small children. So take them seriously if they say they're hearing God. Next thing is to experiment. Experiment. If you think that God is speaking to you, and usually that prompting comes in a whisper, just a little prompting inside of you to do a small step of obedience. If you think that's happening, try it and see what happens. God may prompt you to call a friend. God may prompt you to go across the room and talk to that guy. God may call you to explore a serving opportunity or give some money to a particular person or a particular cause. Do what God tells you to do and see what comes from it. And if you see that kind of thing bearing fruit, you go, aha, that was God. That was God's voice. You keep on experimenting with that, taking steps of obedience. And what I find is when I obey God in the small stuff, he reveals to me the big stuff much more readily, because I show that my heart is one of obedience. Next thing is 5-bar experiences. What do I mean by this? Well, back to the cell phone analogy once again. We have some times in our life where we can hear things very clearly on the cell phone. Sometimes there's distraction, and there's little bars that tell you just how good your reception is. When your reception is really good, you get 5 bars. Well, the same thing is true when you're listening to God. For those of you who have walked with God for a long time, and you can look back on your life, at certain times you say, I know God spoke to me there. Go back to those times and ask yourself, what are my 5-bar experiences? Do some journaling and ask, what do those experiences have in common with each other? Number 5 is peace and joy. Peace and joy. So you take a look at your life, and as you pray and ask God, is this your will? Things that are in God's will give you an increasing sense of peace and joy. If your life is filled with disruption or chaos or guilt, as you think about something that is headed towards the future, it is likely not God speaking to you. Because things that accompany God are peace and joy. Bring these things to him, and if those expand, then it's a likely sign that this really is God speaking to you. One of the prayers that I pray, and I learned this from Wendell Nelson, is, God, if this is from you, if there's a prompting or an idea or a strategy or something you want to do, if this is from you, make it bigger and more obvious. And if this is not from you, let it fade away from my passion and from my circumstances. Sometimes you go into a waiting mode and just ask God, is this of you? And if so, make it bigger and more obvious. And he shows himself that way. Last thing I want to encourage you to do is to memorize God's word. Make your home in God's word. Read it every single day. What I find is when I'm listening for God's voice, God's word that I've memorized comes out in me at the most interesting times. Conversations, decision-making, between sleep and wakefulness, asking for wisdom and direction, God's word comes into my mind. And it's not that 15 years ago when I was memorizing God's word and whatever passage came to my mind that I was thinking about this moment. I wasn't. But what I find is that God uses those things to speak to me loud and clear when I get to that moment. So spend your life studying, memorizing God's words, and not just one little verse here and there. I want to challenge you to memorize big chunks like chapters or books of the Bible and allow God to speak into your soul that way. You'll be amazed how much God retrieves that in your life and uses it to guide you as you head to the future. So 7 things that you can be doing to learn God's voice.